Welcome to You Have My Sword. In this episode, I'm going to answer the questions I now regret asking you to write in. So let's talk about it. Paul McBride writes, Lord of the Rings Socioeconomics. What keeps their economy going? Who do big money hustlers of the realm at? Inquiring minds would like to know. Thank you. Okay, Paul, what a cool and fun question. I may even have some answers for you. I've actually thought a lot about the economics of Middle Earth, and I've done some research to kind of quantify it. And so we're going to go through that. In Middle Earth, they specialize in different things depending on what region they're in, right? But overall, agriculture is essentially a mainstay. So many areas of Middle Earth were left unoccupied or lost to war or plague or, occupied by orcs or giant spiders that don't care much for socioeconomics. Real minimalists they are, right? So with a handful of habitable pockets of Middle Earth, we have not one unified economy, so to speak, but insular economies sometimes reach other pockets, if that makes sense. While none of this is canon, we can put on our context clues, Blue's Clues hat, and make some deductions here. We have the Shire. The Shire is essentially an idealized pre-industrial English society, right? Like that place reeks of like English rose, tea time, tiny Victorian child vibes. We know they live very simple, soft lives that are focused on simplicity. Hobbits are simple people, as are their lives. Hobbits do things they love and don't veer outside of that so much. So they monetize what would be their hobbies, such as farming and gardening, which includes cash crops such as tobacco and produce. We know they enjoy drinking and, as we see, Rosie Cotton working at the bar, the Green Dragon, insinuating they brew their own beer and mead. So that's kind of cool. They've got like an entire brewery economy in the Shire. There is definitely a hospitality industry in the Shire, as well as domestic servants such as gardeners and public servants such as the Bounders. There must be lawyers of some sort, as Bilbo does leave a will, along with physicians, midwives, and other professionals to keep a small, isolated town together. There's definitely enough money that a leisured class can exist. There is no indication that Bilbo needs or wants to work, but he's kind of rich to begin with. So I think he kind of comes from like generational wealth. And the Hobbit town of Bree also seems to be similar, just a little rougher around the edges, right? The Hobbit's biggest export, though, is babies. The Hobbits stay fucking. Rosie Cotton and Samwise have 13 kids of their own. 13 of their own. And this is pretty average for hobbits to be breeding this way. So you got to be able to sell at least one of those for a good amount, or at least sell one of them. Like, just pick your least favorite, sell one, and put the rest through Hobbit Community College, right? So that's the Shire's dark secret, is they have so many babies that they sell one and then they live off the profit. I mean, that's my guess. With that said, though, if you're having 13 kids, which, like I said, is an average for hobbits, the economy there is generally good for everyone. Plenty of jobs and resources. As they say, it takes a village. With that said, though, we're going to move over to Gondor. Now, sorry, I'm like drinking my coffee. I always forget when I'm recording that like the slurping comes in so hard, and my poor producer Rachel is probably like, "You're disgusting. Stop it." Okay, now over in Gondor, the realm of men seems to have a well-developed quasi-late medieval economy, although Gondor in general had declined from the glory days of kings. It was still a renowned and busy kingdom. Parts of Minas Tirith were organized by business and craft. There's a reference to Lampright Street, where a guest house is located. Pippin meets Virgil there. Surrounding areas are probably mostly agricultural. The Pelennor was farmland before being overrun. There is mention of fisher folk in Lebanon, a well-rounded kingdom full of different trades and varied types of laborers, as with any traditional kingdom. Pretty basic stuff. They may not have been an epicenter of trade, but they kept their own economy and people afloat comfortably. So kind of like I said, it seems like a lot of like trade and stuff is pretty insular. They're doing what they can to keep their general areas afloat alone. There's not a ton of like import-export in Middle Earth that I can see. So Over in Rohan's economy, as we know them to be horse lords, we can easily ascertain that their economy and primary trade is based on farming and, most importantly, animal husbandry, especially of horses. We can assume Rohan is the primary source in Middle-earth for horses, likely providing many with horses outside of Rohan itself. So we can safely assume that Rohan is the lead export of horses to other kingdoms. So they are doing more exporting likely than importing. And we can probably safely assume that the dwarves sold goods and their services as craftsmen. We know that dwarves hoard wealth and gold. That is quite simply their shit. So they all probably have some dichotomy of shared generational wealth that takes care of their own. But for trade, dwarves likely sell the wares from their crafts or trade for other goods they cannot farm or acquire themselves. Like, hey, Hobbit, you want an axe longer than your body for a barrel of apples? That's how I imagine dwarf trades going down, right? So dwarves are probably, in my opinion, again, none of this is canon. In my opinion, they are doing more importing, since I don't believe them to be farmer folk. So they're probably importing and doing a lot of trading of their crafts for imports like food. Now, it's interesting to think about how the elves may have supported themselves as the most insular of all the races of Middle-earth. The Sylvan elves of Mirkwood engage in trade with the men of Laketown, but whether they barter or use money is not stated. They import wines and, other food and stuff, like either directly or via Laketown. So Laketown seems to be their primary source of imports, if that makes sense. The elves are so insular that it seems like they find a trusted source, sort of like Laketown, which I think is the best example. They find a trusted source where they could import and just kind of go from there. I truly have no idea what or how the elves of Lothlorien feed themselves. They must have farming areas that the Fellowship didn't see. Despite what Peter Jackson implied in the Hobbit movie, all elves are not vegetarians, though some may be. Tolkien provided elven words for livestock and game animals, plus eggs, butter, milk, and honey, and hunting is a popular elven activity. So there seems to be a weird idea that all elves are like vegetarian or vegan, but I don't think that's the case. Tolkien has said that that is not the case. Overall, I'd hedge a bet to say that trade was the most common way to acquire goods or services, as money was rarely mentioned in Tolkien's work, although it was mentioned. We know in Gondor there is a currency called the Castar, and also a coin called a Tharni, which was 1/4 of a Castar, essentially a quarter to the dollar. It appears from Tolkien's work that hobbits and dwarves would have used coin money the most. In fact, Bilbo took home 2 chests of gold and silver, which could also be used as currency along with bronze in denominations of pieces or pence. After the defeat of Smaug, which would be a silly thing to do if minted currency wasn't important. So obviously there is currency, it's minted, it's important, but it doesn't seem to be used that often. But I want to touch on just how much Bilbo fucking sucks. My man's already has generational wealth and was living comfortably and jobless, smoking weed all day. He sat on these 2 chests of gold and silver and didn't even distribute it back into his own insular economy of his hometown of the Shire. Like, that feels insane to me. Like, he just brought it home and sat on it. He didn't redistribute it or nothing. Like, what the fuck? Whatever. Hashtag eat the rich. Fuck him. Okay, next question. Okay. Rachel, I am live streaming this on Twitch. I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the podcast. And the chat would like me to tell you that they appreciate you and all of your hard work. Okay. Now, on to the next question. Aaron O'Day writes, are there any dogs or dog-like creatures kept as pets in Middle-earth? Aaron O'Day is the ultimate dog person. This is a very cute question coming from her. and I appreciate her asking this. Okay, so, well, we all know of one iconic dog, Juan, the Hound of Valinor, who was a key player in the story of Beren and Luthien. He is said to essentially resemble an Irish wolfhound. Juan was owned by Kellerbern, and Juan is known to be the first subservient dog, you could say, to be domesticated under an elf. But there is some writings that allude to the elves having other hounds for scouting or hunting purposes, just not on the godlike level of Juan. He was like totally different. He was like a god dog, I guess. Dogs are also mentioned in The Hobbit. In Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders, Thorin and company are in Mirkwood, having just crossed the enchanted stream, when they become aware of the dim blowing of horns in the woods and the sounds of dogs baying far off. Then they all fell silent, and it seemed they could hear the noise of a great hunt going by to the north of the path, though they saw no sign of it. So those hunters they heard were some of Thranduil's people. So again, elven hounds to accompany them on hunts or scouting excursions. I do find it hard to believe in places like the Shire, where they live very familial lives, they wouldn't have dogs as a true domestic pet, along with cats. I feel like they probably have dogs or cats as domestic pets in the Shire. It just kind of feels right. Again, none of this is canon. It just feels correct, right? I'd also be willing to bet in places with agriculture and animal husbandry, they would have herding dogs to keep their livestock in check, right? Makes sense to me. Taking a sip of my coffee before we go to the next question. Okay. Mike Brady writes, how did Azog the Defiler get his name? Okay, so this is not a fun story by any stretch, but we will get into just how and why he got the war name Defiler, and it'll make sense pretty fucking quickly. So Azog, who is a Gundabad orc, entered history in the year 3rd Age 2790 due to Dwarven King Thor's desire to revisit and perhaps restore the lost realm of Khazad-dûm. Long story short, Azog beheaded Thor. Azog then called out that he had killed Thor, and that he now ruled Moria as king, staking his claim well and truly, right? Azog carved his own name in runes onto the brow of Thor's decapitated head, forever branding it into the hearts of the dwarves. Now, Nar was barred from retrieving the head of Thor, and the Arks threw him a small pouch of coins of little worth as a final gesture of scorn. Nar took the pouch, turned and fled, and when he looked back, the orcs had emerged from the gate and were hacking apart Thor's body and flinging the pieces of carrion to a bunch of crows. So, pretty easy to assume how he got that name and reputation. But don't worry, though. As we know, Azog fully got his. But that's a great question, and it's hopefully a fucked up answer. Next question. Quantum Cartographer writes, who is your dream casting of Celebrimbor? So we know Celebrimbor to be both handsome and a skilled craftsman involved in the forging of the rings, along with Annatar, who was Sauron in disguise. Celebrimbor was an Oldoran prince and the last in line of the House of Feanor who lived in Middle-earth. He was a ruler of Eregion in the Second Age. Unlike both his father and his grandfather, Celebrimbor was portrayed as being both selfless and kind, and he was neither prideful nor covetous of anything he created. So he was a big departure from his heritage, essentially, and he was essentially a pretty good guy. Aside from falling for Sauron's deception, he was pretty beloved. He was described to have an almost dwarvish obsession with crafts. He became famous as an artificer and smith in both Gondolin and Eregion. His love for crafts took him to Eregion, where he was introduced to a precious metal that was later to be called mithril. We're all familiar with mithril, right? So, long story short, he was a hunk that was a kind, albeit a little naive, but he was a man that was fully about his crafts. He was talented, humble, and thoughtful. So essentially, Celebrimbor is a himbo, right? And I mean that, and I mean that in the most loving way possible. He's one of my favorite characters. But he's like super hot and naive, and he's talented. He doesn't even realize it, right? So he's kind of a himbo. So immediately someone like Chris Hemsworth comes to mind, or even someone like Charlie Hunnam, who is best known as playing, who was it? Jax Teller on Sons of Anarchy, and he also played King Arthur. These are pretty traditionally attractive men, but you don't need to be a traditional hunk to portray a hunk, in my opinion. And I think even someone like Nicholas Hoult would be great, as I find him to have like kind of like an ethereal quality to his acting. And I do find him to be quite attractive, actually. In fact, he actually played Tolkien in the recent Tolkien film about his life. I will say, I am fucking awful with actors and actresses. I don't follow celebs closely and can rarely tell who is in anything I watch. For those of you that can watch a movie and pinpoint the last 3 films like a sub character was in, hats off to you, but also, are you okay? Like, how do you know that? How do you recognize these people? My fucking like facial recognition software is broken as fuck. Like, I can remember names, but I cannot remember faces, and I don't know what that's about. Chris McCracken writes, how did Ungoliant die? This is a fun question, again, with a fucked up answer. Surprise. Okay, so we know Ungoliant to be a truly evil bestial spider that had an alliance with Morgoth. Nobody is quite sure how she came to be, not even the Valar. Total mystery. Ungoliant was getting into some beef with the Balrogs and was ultimately driven off by them. She fled to Non-Dungortheb, say that 3 times fast, otherwise known as the Valley of Dreadful Death, where she bred with the great spiders that dwelt there, increasing the terror and power of her own kind. Yeah, to say the fucking least. The creatures that later infested that area were her surviving offspring and descendants, including Shelob, who dwelt from the 2nd and 3rd ages onwards on the borders of Mordor as her last surviving child. And we know Shelob very well from the films. So it is said that Angolian ultimately perished at her own hands when, in her ever-growing hunger, she eventually devoured herself. Yep, she ate herself. And that's how she died. She got greedy and literally ate her own body. Fucking insane. So, yeah, very cool and normal. But hey, great question. Hope this answer was everything you hoped for and more. Okay, next question. Big Dave Lazard writes, who is the most powerful dragon in Middle-earth? Dope question, my guy. I love talking about dragons almost as much as I love talking about swords. And we're going to talk about all the dragons. This question actually inspired my next episode after this, which will be about one of the dragons. So place your bets on which dragon it's going to be about. We have Glaurung, who was slain by Turambar, also known as Father of Dragons. Glaurung might be one of my favorite dragons based on description and companion art alone. Google this fucker, the art is sick. And then we have Ancalagon the Black, the mightiest winged dragon to have ever lived, slain by Arendil. If I had to award a medal to the mightiest dragon in Middle-earth, it would likely be Ancalagon. So I'm going to give it to him. But let's go through the rest of the dragons in Middle-earth just for fun. We have Scatha, the worm, slain by Fram. The horde of Scatha guarded was taken from the dwarves. Thus, Fram, taking it, led to arguments and his eventual death at the hands of the dwarves. Kind of like our boy Smaug. And then we have the Great Cold Drake, a cold drake of great power, which attacked dwarves of Grey Mountains and killed Dane the First, who was a dwarven king of the Durin's folk. There's a common theme here with dwarves and dragons, as I'm sure you're piecing together. And then we have the fire drake of Gondolin, a large dragon that participated in the fall of Gondolin, which is like, that's an episode I've been scripting over the course of a couple weeks, because that is a very, very, very interesting story. So we will talk about the fall of Gondolin in its own episode. And then we have Smaug, slain with the black arrow by Bard the Bowman, who then went on to be King Bard of Dale. We obviously see this go down in The Hobbit. In case you were wondering, dragons are attracted to gold, which is, why dwarves seemingly have so many issues with dragons, because they hoard their wealth and dragons want a piece of that shit. They are gold diggers to the full extent. Okay, and then we have Gostir, and this dragon is a name-only known individual. Not much else is known about this dragon. And then finally, another favorite of mine is another unnamed dragon mentioned in The Horde from The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, who is described as having red eyes, black wings, and teeth like knives. This guy sounds like a total sicko, and I wish we knew more about him. Again, with this dragon, the companion art and fan art, super sick. And that kind of concludes this episode. Thank you so much for listening. This was really fun, and I really enjoyed doing a Q&A episode, and I would like to do these every so often to kind of mitigate the episodes. So if you guys have questions, you can email me through the website. You have myswordpodcast.com. You can tweet me, or you can DM me. Choose your own fucking adventure. But as always, thank you for listening. Please check out youhavemyswordpodcast.com. All the links to socials are there. Links to Patreon are there. And I think a link to my Ko-fi is there. And if you support me on Patreon or Ko-fi, you get a link to my Discord, which is a chaotic hellscape. So, I would love to have you. And as always, thank you. And you have my sword.
Edgeworks Nebula.